Why don't we murder other people? Crazy question, I know, but have you ever really thought about it? I guess we don't think about it that often because we just take it as a given. Most sane people just don't have an urge to murder other people. They've never seriously considered taking another person's life. But the question remains, why? It may be your first instinct to say, because it's wrong, or because it's immoral, which I agree with, but it doesn't really answer my question. You haven't addressed why we don't have a desire to murder, and in fact, you haven't even answered how we know not to murder. If your answer is because it's immoral, you have to first define what it means to be moral, and why murder doesn't fit within those parameters. So I press further. Why is it immoral to murder? Whence comes that morality? A lot of people will tell you that morality comes from God. That their holy book of choice, being the perfect word of God, contains all the guidelines and doctrines and commands that will lead you to live a good, moral life. The 10 Commandments tell us not to murder, not to lie, not to steal, not to cheat on your spouse. Jesus said to love thy neighbor, to forgive your enemies, to turn the other cheek. According to this argument, morality is handed down to humanity from a supreme deity, an idea called divine command theory. In fact, this is the ideological origin of the slogan, "America is a Christian nation," meaning that the Constitution and our general legal system are based upon the God-ordained Judeo-Christian morality detailed in the Bible. People who make this argument believe that our own legal system, a reflection of our moral system, is a series of divine commands. Indeed, this is how European legal systems operated from the end of the 16th century all the way until the French Revolution, under a political theory called the divine right of kings. According to this theory, monarchs were ordained by God to rule, meaning that they were beholden to no earthly authority, and that any decrees made by the monarch were reflections of God's will. That is to say, God ruled through the monarch. Any violation of the monarch's law, or any challenge to his legitimacy, was therefore an affront to God himself, a violation of God's moral code. The divine right of kings allowed the monarch to legislate morality, much like God himself under divine command theory. But that's where we run into problems with this kind of system. Imagine that the monarch one day decided that all men must keep their beards shorter than 6 inches long, or else be thrown in jail. According to the divine right of kings, this decree is God's will, and thus it must be moral to have a short beard. But what's so moral about that? Even if you don't while away your hours pondering the nature of morality, I dare say that your common sense notion of what is right and wrong would tell you that there's nothing especially horrendous about growing your facial hair out longer than 6 inches. And what purpose would a law like that serve? Who would it benefit? Who's being hurt by long beards? What standard of anything is this law based on? It seems ridiculous. Arbitrary, even. And now imagine that that kind of arbitration gets applied to something much more important than the length of one's facial hair. The monarch decrees that it is now legal to murder. And according to the divine right of kings, because the decree comes from God's will, it must not be a moral offense to take another human being's life. Even though murder was a crime yesterday, God is a-okay with it today, and that must be a legitimate reason because God is right in his judgment, no matter what. God is perfect, and every decision he makes is, by definition, morally sound. So when God says in the Bible that it's okay to own slaves and stone homosexuals to death, but that it's morally reprehensible to eat shellfish and wear polyester, we can just take his word for it. Do you now see the problem with this kind of moral philosophy? When you give someone the authority to legislate morality, then morality is subject to the whim of that person. And when morality can change on a whim, then why should we take it seriously? If legislated top-down, morality is not intrinsically valuable, but rather derives its value extrinsically from the authority of the legislator. And if morality is contingent on the authority of a moral arbiter, then if you take away that moral arbiter, then morality must go away too. A lot of theists will tell you that this is, in fact, an argument in support of the existence of God and divine command theory, Because the fact that a general sense of right and wrong does exist must indicate that a divine moral arbiter exists as well, but tell me, if God didn't exist, would it suddenly be okay to murder people? If there were no moral arbiter, would you go around murdering people? I think you would be hard-pressed to find someone who would answer that question in the affirmative. So we have to come to the conclusion that morality is, in fact, not dependent on a moral arbiter. It is internally robust enough that it can stand on its own and be justified based on its own merit. It is, in this sense, objective, whereas divine command theory makes morality subjective. And that's exactly the problem with divine command theory. The argument essentially boils down to, because God said so, or because God will punish us if we don't do as he has commanded, and that doesn't really hold much water if you can't prove the existence of God or that your moral code reflects God's will. You need to have a better reason behind it. Let me repeat that. Reason. Reason! If there's one word that characterizes the Age of Enlightenment, it's reason. The Enlightenment was an attempt to divorce morality and other modes of thought from a religious worldview, and instead test the validity of moral claims with verifiable evidence and rationality. So while a religious person might say, murder is wrong because God says it's wrong, an Enlightenment thinker would most likely say, murder is wrong because human life has intrinsic worth, and it is morally reprehensible to deprive another person of their inherent right to life. Notice that there's no mention of God here. Even though most Enlightenment thinkers did actually believe in God, the arguments they made regarding morality, philosophy, and science were largely devoid of any kind of divine interference. To these thinkers, morality was a human project. And I agree with them. If God's moral judgments are logically or ethically indefensible, then why keep them? And if you can rationalize God's judgments through your own reason, then why do you need God in the first place? Divine command theory makes morality arbitrary, and if objective morality doesn't come from God, it must come from humans. But we've also established that human morality can't come from the top down like the divine right of kings. It must come from the bottom up, from rules and values that everybody agrees upon and cooperates within the framework of. But that leaves the question, where does that consensus come from? How did every person in such a far-flung human society wind up agreeing which very specific behaviors were socially acceptable? Surely you don't think that someone somewhere decided one day that murder was wrong and everybody just got on board with it. No, a norm as powerful as morality had to have had an extremely strong societal backing behind it, and that backing had to have been based on a pretty damn persuasive reason if everybody thought it was good enough to structure a whole society around it. Well, if you want to answer that question, you've got to stretch back all the way to the beginning of human history, and I mean about 200,000 years back. That's because, to the best of our knowledge, morality and moral behavior are evolved traits. I've gone into detail in other videos about how this works, but in short, humans are evolved to be altruistic. We are evolved to be social. Cooperative behavior arose in humans as a response to evolutionary pressures, and it is our sociality that forms the biological basis of our empathy. We recognize other members of our species. We recognize that they are, in fact, human. And, at least in theory, we treat them the way that we would want to be treated. It is the earliest form of one of the most fundamental precepts in moral philosophy, the intrinsic value of human life. It is not something that is simply decided, neither by God nor by man. It is a predisposed framework that we bring to every moral analysis. If human life were not valuable, then why would we care if we were moral or not? By all evidence, what we call morality is an inherent behavior predicated upon the well-being of humanity, and to the best of my knowledge, this is the closest we can get to a truly objective moral code. Morality is not what appeals to the few, it's what works for everyone. It comes from the bottom up. It is something that everyone agrees upon because it is wired into our brains. For a governing moral law to have any kind of legitimacy, it needs to reflect the principles that humanity has already agreed to act in accordance with, an agreement we might call the consent of the governed. This idea of the consent of the governed is usually associated with political theory, and most notably with John Locke's essay concerning human understanding, in which he argues that a government can only be legitimate if its citizens agree to be governed by it. Locke says that the main role of government is to protect the natural rights of its citizens. life, liberty, and property. If the government does not protect its citizens' rights, then the citizens can withdraw their consent to be governed. If the government is acting unjustly, the citizens can withdraw consent. If the government is oppressing individuals within the society, then those oppressed individuals can withdraw consent. If the government does not represent the will of the people or act toward the common good of all, then the citizens withdraw consent. And I'm going to go a step further and argue that the consent of the governed is not only required for government, but also for morality. If a moral law doesn't work for everyone, then it is not moral. If it doesn't reflect humanity's innate cooperation and altruism, then it is not moral. What we call immoral is a failure to apply our foundational moral framework of empathy to others. It is, in evolutionary terms, non-cooperative behavior. There's a reason that this kind of behavior is called antisocial. Not just because it is against society's norms, but because it is against our social nature. So if someone claiming to wield moral authority decreed that murder, theft, and slavery were all moral goods, then we would withdraw our consent to be governed by these moral laws. We would not abide by them. This is why morality cannot be legislated. Humanity does not reflect the will of moral authority. Morality reflects the most fundamental desires of humanity, the desire to live a life free of harm, oppression, or malice. And this is why authoritarianism cannot work. It pays no heed to the consent of the governed. Dictatorships like Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, or totalitarian societies like the Soviet Union or Communist China, did not reflect the will of the people, only the will of those highest up in the government. And it's why the moral authoritarians of the social justice movement make a mockery of morality. They think themselves the arbiters of what is and isn't acceptable, what you can and can't say, what you can and can't wear, what you can and can't enjoy, what you can and can't think. And they suppose their moral codes so perfect as to be beyond dispute, beyond question. It is to simply be accepted as true, and as soon as that becomes their outlook, their morality becomes arbitrary. It's no different than the divine right of kings. I say it is moral, therefore it must be so. Their morality is assumed to be correct, but without knowing why. This is the inevitable fate of moral authoritarianism. If you refuse to even entertain moral codes other than your own, then you lose sight of what made your morals so good in the first place. You have no frame of reference, no opposing idea to be juxtaposed against what you believe to be the truth, and without that point of comparison, you have no way of being able to say, this is good, this is bad, this is better, this is worse. You lose the reasoning behind your morals, and if your morals have no reason behind them, then how can you honestly think that trying to arbitrarily impose them on others is going to convince anyone to behave the way you want them to? If you really want people to believe that your moral vision is correct, then you have to convince them of it based on the merits of your ideas. If it really is so great, then it should be able to hold up on its own, and you shouldn't have to force it on people. And when your authoritarian attitudes become so rigid that any dissenters are shamed and ostracized and their ideas are shouted down into oblivion, you virtually create a world in which no other ideas are allowed to exist, and people self-censor for the sake of avoiding aggression and violence. And that's when people go underground, the most dangerous situation you can have in a civil society. It's underground where radicals are bred. It's underground where there's no other voice to counter the most disgusting and evil forces of humanity. It's underground where resentment builds and bides in an ideological pressure cooker until it finally explodes in a torrent of hatred and destruction. And then you'll have yourselves to blame. You didn't recognize the true severity of the situation until it was too late, because you didn't allow them to expose themselves out in the open. You thought that shutting them out would get rid of the problem, but it only masked it. You thought you could rule over them without their consent. The thing about real bigotry is that it's like a disease. You can treat the symptoms by making them disappear for a little while, but they'll keep coming back over and over again until you cure the root cause of the problem. And the cure isn't censorship. The cure is more speech. The cure is education. Simply telling people that they're wrong isn't a solution. The solution is to tell them why they're wrong. You have to converse with them. You have to speak their language. And nobody speaks the language of shame. Trying to shame the other person only makes them hate you more and makes you feel better about yourself. A truly productive conversation is one in which both parties are willing to entertain the other side. If you shut the other side out, then you won't gain anything from it, regardless of whether you're right or wrong. If you're right, then you won't understand why. If you're wrong, then you won't ever be convinced of the truth and you won't learn anything. But if you're absolutely convinced that the rest of the population is so morally depraved that they'll never be able to think like you, that they're too ignorant to accept your more enlightened morality, and that they won't start behaving correctly unless you force them to, well, doesn't that just make you the most arrogant, condescending, self-righteous person on the planet? If that's really how you think, if your ideas can't hold up on their own without needing to be forced on others, then maybe that's a sign that your ideas weren't that great in the first place. Maybe that's a sign that you're wrong. So please, please just listen, even to ideas that you don't agree with. We need it now more than ever, and you just might learn something in the end.